Hello and welcome to the 17th video update from the What If interactive wargame campaign run by the Battle of Prestonpans Heritage Trust here in East Lothian, reimagining what might have happened in 1745 if the Jacobite army's strategic decisions had been made by public vote on social media. So, welcome to old friends and new. The campaign, after a period of stalemate, has suddenly burst into life, and it's time to bring you the news from the first few days of April 1746. I thought I'd start by having a look back at the Grand Strategic Map, which we've not looked at for a little while. You can see that in terms of Scotland, Fort Augustus and Fort William are still held by very small government garrisons, but most of the rest of Scotland is in Jacobite hands. In fact, the recruitment roll for April has recruited a little bit of a Highland reinforcement for the garrison at Fort George. It's on its way as we speak. And the Marquis of Tullibardin's forces, after a march over to Glasgow, have now come back and are outside Berwick, as we know, blockading it from landward supply, Berwick having been recaptured by that militia force that had sprung up out of the north of England and the southwest of Scotland. So there's a stalemate outside Berwick, most of Scotland relatively passive other than that. There are very small redcoat garrisons at Carlisle, York and Worcester. But other than that, basically the only forces in any shape to operate are the two main armies, the Franco-Jacobite force just outside Reading and the British Army itself, headed by the King, George II, in London. He's actually pulled in a couple of militia units that were guarding the roads either side of the city. As some of you had pointed out to us, they weren't being able to do much, frankly, and so they were more use if they were pulled in. Now, the Jacobites had been disconcerted by a recent French naval defeat, that was the last video, which made it very unlikely that any sense of reinforcement and resupply would be coming through to the French anytime soon. What should the Jacobites therefore do? There was the possibility of marching out towards Worcester or towards Manchester to perhaps potentially try and raise support in Wales, or to head back towards York, and maybe even those who considered the situation in Scotland severe enough to suggest a withdrawal all the way back up there, or a division of Jacobite forces to try and reinforce Tullibardin's position. In the end, the Jacobites decided to do none of these, and we'll come to what they chose to do in a moment. The Redcoats also had a decision to make in the wake of that victory. Did they want to attempt to put some pressure on Tullibardin by sending reinforcements, perhaps by sea, to Berwick, or indeed sending some forces up via York on to Berwick to break the landward blockade? There were options available. In the end, however, everybody seems to have accepted that the battle, or the war rather, was going to be won in the southwest of England, and so it was here that the deadlock really had to be broken. Zooming into that front then, and to our trusty 1755 map of the southeast of England, this is the situation. The French and Jacobite forces have merged north of the Thames at Reading, and George II has consolidated all of his forces into London itself. It's only really going to be if one of these two armies takes the initiative and makes a move that the campaign down here is going to move towards some sort of a resolution. There's political pressure building behind George II, people getting frustrated that he's not able to take command of the situation and get the Jacobite threat dealt with, and that will soon be reflected in recruitment penalties outside of the city if he doesn't get on the move. Meanwhile, the Jacobites, of course, are under supply and logistical pressure as well, especially after that French defeat in the Channel, and so both sides have reasons to want to push this towards a conclusion. The Jacobites decided that they needed to threaten something so important that George II would be compelled to march out and fight for it. And the decision was taken, as proposed by one of our Facebook Council of War, to march on Portsmouth. Chatham Docks had already been raided successfully, of course, from the landward side by the French forces earlier in the campaign. George II couldn't allow something like that to happen to Portsmouth. Portsmouth would require a formal siege, however. Although its defences were to improve historically through the 18th century, they were still formidable in 1745. You can see here from this 18th century plan, landward defences around the dockyard and around the town and around Gosport to prevent bombardment from the other side of the harbour. And there's also a fort up at Portsbridge leading on to Portsea Island. If the Jacobites wanted to take this seriously, they would have to march onto Portsea Island after taking that fort, or they would have to come round and invest Gosport from this side. So this was going to be a big and serious operation, but they weren't really intending to besiege Portsmouth seriously. They wanted to draw George II out to prevent them from being able to do so. The Jacobites make the move. They make it very loudly, very obviously. They are intending to draw the government forces out of London. They move in two parallel columns because the Jacobite forces themselves can move faster than the French regulars accompanying them. So they divide at Basingstoke, and Charles Edward takes a slightly longer route, giving him the opportunity to proclaim his father in the psychologically significant town of Winchester, before moving down towards where they intend to establish their siege camps. Meanwhile, the French also send out a strong cavalry force to Guildford, and they send that there so that they can watch the principal road down which the British army would move if it were to advance out of London to relieve Portsmouth. They want to have enough warning of the British armies coming that they will be able to move away from their siege works and choose a sensible battlefield. Meanwhile, as you can see on the map, before I drew all over it, George II has immediately responded on hearing of the Jacobite army moving out of Reading and going southwards. He's moved to Hampton Court and brought the main force behind him towards Kingston-on-Thames. Just moving on to a different map of the 18th century area, just to give you another idea of the lay of the land. Guildford down there in the bottom left, that occupied by a strong picket of French cavalry. It had to be a strong force because it's so far from the main army that it was potentially very vulnerable. It had to be quite a long way up the road in order to provide enough of a warning screen to allow the Jacobites to pick the battlefield if the British army chooses to come on. If it comes, that British army moving from Kingston will come down through Cobham on this road here and will have to cross the bridge at Guildford to march south to the relief of Portsmouth. Now, after weeks of relative inactivity, the British army in London has suddenly burst into life. Henry Hawley is detached with a large force of cavalry and he's sent down to Guildford as soon as they're aware that there's a French picket there, because they not only want to clear the road, but they want to take as many of those men out of action as possible before any coming major engagement, and, if possible, deny Charles Edward the news and information that those cavalrymen might be able to carry. And so, at Guildford, on the 2nd of April 1746, a clash of arms takes place. Of course, this means that I've had to very quickly become acquainted with the layout of 18th century Guildford. We do have a few plans of this one slightly later than our battle would have occurred, but you can see the main features, the river way running through here, and the main road from London on the right, running through here, forming the High Street and crossing Guildford Bridge here. You can see the principal church laid just to the south side of the High Street, and here, just beyond it, the ruins of the old castle. So we started building our model of 18th century Guildford from the castle on its mott. It's a fast-paced cavalry action we're expecting today, so it's not going to be a major feature of the fighting, but it is a major feature of the landscape. Just so you're clear, the one on the right is the model. We also have this lovely mid-18th century view of Guildford from the high ground where our French cavalry pickets were based, as we'll hear shortly. Just pick out the features for you then, running through this lovely green landscape, the river itself, passing a mixture of wharves and large gardens. The main road carried over Guildford Bridge, and the High Street. There is the church. There is the castle. We think our tabletop has given a fairly decent representation of that landscape. The river running through here, Guildford Bridge, heading off there goes the High Street. There's the church. there's the castle. Just a little downstream of Guildford itself, there is also a river crossing, a small ford underneath St Catherine's Hill. As an 18th century view, the ruins of the chapel on the left and our interpretation of it appearing on our right. And we've extended the plan towards that ford so that there is a secondary crossing point on the table. This is our table area on the modern OS map with the river running through here, St Catherine's and the ford there marching that extreme edge, the castle and the church and the main road crossing the river running through here. Now, as you can make out on the Ordnance Survey map, there are some very significant hills on the far side of the river. There is this one, the Mount, which is a very high position, adjacent to Stag Hill, where the cathedral stands today, and there's another height here around St Catherine's. So it seemed natural that our French cavalry picket would base itself in the area of the high ground overlooking the river crossings, rather than posting themselves in the confines of the town itself. And on a slightly cropped aerial view of our table, there we can see the same features, the river running through the centre, the main road over Guildford Bridge, the ford by St Catherine's Chapel on the edge. Although it's not obvious from the heights, there are three significant hill areas here, and they will be difficult to ascend. They will slow movement and give an advantage to anybody defending from the top. The French have a picket over on Stag Hill in the area where the cathedral now stands. They have their main force overlooking Guildford Bridge itself from the Mount, and they also have, over at St Catherine's, a squadron of the Royal Étrangère watching the ford. Now, the French might not be expecting a sudden aggressive attack by British cavalry, but of course those British units do have to come through the narrow streets and over the bridges in order to get at them. So they do have an advantage. The British forces do have to consolidate into columns to move around. In our urban settings and siege and bridge attacks, we use a sort of assault column that has some fighting capacity and reduced firing capacity, not relevant admittedly for these cavalry units, but they're not quite as vulnerable as march columns. They are, however, vulnerable if they move completely without support, and despite having the advantage of the early initiative, Hawley's cavalry attack goes awry at the very beginning. Kerr's dragoons charge unsupportedly straight down the high street, straight over the bridge, but then fail to be able to deploy into line. This means that the French, sitting on the heights above them, can't resist the opportunity, of course, and charge. And in the first phase of the engagement, Kerr's dragoons are utterly routed. The French consolidate, bringing their unit over from Stag Hill, the Chabrillon squadron forming up in support with the other two squadrons that are available to them in the centre, looking down still on Guildford Bridge. Slightly stuttering start over at St Catherine's as well. A squadron of the Blues rush towards the ford but don't quite have the space to get deployed into line over the ford itself, so they're still on the wrong side to engage, although the St Albans Rangers, raised after the government's victory at Sandridge earlier in the year, they do move up and they fire some harassing shots at pretty long range with their carbines across the river towards the Royal Étrangère. Eventually, though, the Blues do get moving. They get across the river and they form line and they charge the French picket beyond, with the Rangers coming up in support. And the fighting gets underway in the shadow of the ruins of St Catherine's Chapel. As you can see, the Blues have successfully driven straight over the Royal Étrangère, driving them back but not routing them. They follow up with a pursuit and continue to charge. Meanwhile, the squadron of Cobham's dragoons has come up towards the bridge at Guildford but hasn't managed to get across, and so the French do start to contemplate moving one of their squadrons round in support of their comrades. As they do, with the Chabrillon coming down from the heights, but they just don't have the range to actually engage in the combat. All they can do is offer their support, and unfortunately, the Blues successfully push the Étrangers back again, failing to rout them, but nevertheless pushing them off towards the edge of the field. Now, it's a difficult balance for the French during this game to decide how long they want to linger on the battlefield and how much damage they are able to inflict on the British cavalry, because there are reinforcements arriving into Guildford. The time it took for these reinforcements to arrive was determined by a pre-game roll, and of course, the longer the French linger, the more likely they are to get overwhelmed. And sure enough, as soon as the British reinforcements are available, the dice rolls start to turn in their favour. Hawley is able to get a squadron of Cobham's Dragoons and a squadron of the Blues over the river, formed up into line and ready to charge. The Georgia Rangers over at St Catherine's have also deployed into line, and a second Cobham squadron is potentially moving up in support of the main attack too. And soon those forces continue to build. Two squadrons of Hessian cavalry are now sweeping in towards the ford at St Catherine's as well. The longer the French linger on the battlefield, the more the odds are building against them. They've done what they needed to do. They've identified the British advance. Now they need to get out. Meanwhile, the squadron of the Blues that had been fighting the Étrangers and driving them back had turned and faced their supports. They destroyed that French squadron and come staggering up the steep-sided slope of the mount to threaten the rear of the main French position beside the road. The French knew that this was the moment they needed to turn around and disengage entirely. But they failed their order rolls. The result is, of course, a disaster, and the dice very much favour the British forces now. You see there the squadron of Clermont-Tonnerre is completely surrounded and assailed from all sides on the summit of the mount there. And although beyond them, the accompanying squadron is fighting on bravely and actually do win the contest against the Blues, those Blues have the advantage of being designated as a very steady unit. They're able to pass their test and roll the engagement forwards. So those cavalry on the French side are not able to capitalise on their success. And as you see, that final squadron of Cobhams coming up in the rear as well. Of course, the inevitable destruction of the squadron of Clermont-Tonnerre has allowed all of the British forces to concentrate on the last remaining French squadron that's fighting. Over on the far side of the field, though, because of this concentration of fight around the mount, the Royal Étrangers have been able to recover from their disorderly drive back from St Catherine's, and they are now able to turn and slip off the field unopposed. The French have lost heavily. They've lost 3 squadrons. That means their cavalry force will be considerably weakened in the coming campaign. But, crucially, the squadron that has got away will be able to give early notice to the French and the Jacobites that the British army is on the move. And sure enough, the following day, with the road now clear ahead of them, George II and his men cross the bridge at Guildford, and the entire British army marches out, seeking at last a final resolution of this bitter conflict. Now, the original plan was for the French forces moving through Alton to Petersfield and down to Portsea this way, was for them to link up with the main Jacobite force that was coming through Winchester. At the time news reaches them that the British army is indeed moving, the French army is marching south from Petersfield, and the Jacobites are just moving out of Bishop's Waltham. So the decision is taken to concentrate in this area here and deploy for battle and await the British army to march towards them. Here they believe the geography can help to give them victory. They've traded the loss of a few squadrons of cavalry for the time to be able to choose their own battlefield. Suddenly, all talk of stalemates seems to have gone out of the window. We could now be just a few days away from a major confrontation involving all the available forces to both armies in the south of England. We'll be fighting that out on our tabletop very soon, and we'll be bringing the news very soon after that. As always, thanks for watching.